Welcome. Today we're doing a deep dive into something quite profound, maybe even unsettling. We're looking at the sources, tracing what many describe as the unraveling of English politics and culture.
Yeah, it's a strong word, unraveling.
It is. And our goal here is to give you a kind of critical shortcut, analyzing how these long-term structural shifts, in class, economics, race relations, seem to have suddenly accelerated into the political upheaval we're seeing right now.
It really is a critical moment, and I think what the sources really hammer home right from the start is the speed, the sheer speed of this disintegration. It feels like few people really anticipated the pace.
No, the velocity is startling. Let's maybe start with the immediate political shocks. You have a Labor government elected just a year ago, huge mandate, and already it feels like it's being, dismantled.
Effectively dismantled, yeah. And then look at the mobilization almost overnight, it seems, around certain figures, certain sentiments.
What's that march?
Exactly. That's a stunning metric, isn't it? Just this past weekend, a record 150,000 people marching. And this wasn't, a typical protest against government policy.
No, it was a commemoration.
A commemoration for Charlie Kirk, who the sources describe as, a slain right-wing propagandist. His message was very much centered on cultural grievance, on nativism.
And underlying this, the political ground itself is just shifting dramatically. The established parties.
They're struggling. The polls now show Nigel Farage's Reform Party leading both Labour and the Conservatives. And by some distance, apparently.
Which is extraordinary, and it taps into this deep anxiety about immigration, right? But the sources point out a paradox here.
A major paradox. Concern over immigration is apparently at its highest level since 1974. And this is the key thing, the official figures show net immigration has actually been falling recently.
So it's a crisis driven by perception, by feeling.
It seems so. Much more than just the raw statistics,
What's really fascinating, though, and why this probably matters to listeners all over the globe, is how international figures are framing this. They're treating it almost like a civilizational test case.
Absolutely. You've got Elon Musk appearing via satellite link, warning about this rapidly increasing erosion of Britain caused by, in his words, massive uncontrolled immigration.
And then from France, you have Eric Zemmour, the far-right politician, using this really stark language, prophesying the great replacement of our European people. He sees this UK turmoil as symptomatic of a wider European issue.
Right. So outsiders are definitely viewing this not just as some domestic squabble, but as a kind of litmus test for the West. It has implications far beyond the UK.
Okay, so let's try and unpack the structural fault lines here, the things that allowed this fragmentation to take root. You probably need to start with the ruling class, the elite. We often think of aristocracy as rigid, unchanging. But the English elite seems to have been incredibly resilient. How did they manage to hold on to power through centuries of massive economic change?
Well, the key, I think, is their dynamism. George Orwell absolutely nailed it, didn't he, about 80 years ago? He described the English elite, it's a great phrase, as an aristocracy constantly recruited from parvenu, newcomers.
Ah, right. And he had that analogy, the knife.
That's the one, the unforgettable image. The knife, which has had 2 new blades and 3 new handles. The name, the institution, it stays the same, but the components are constantly being replaced.
So the body itself is perpetually renewed, even if the label, the elite, remains.
Exactly. That's its strength, its ability to absorb new wealth, new power from outside.
So when the old landowning aristocracy started to fade, they didn't just collapse, they married into the new money, the wealthy ship owners, the cotton mill owners.
And their kids went to the right schools.
Their sons, learned the right mannerisms at the public schools, as Orwell put it. And this flexibility, this absorption, meant the ruling class wasn't really structurally challenged for long periods. It just adapted.
And you could see that dynamism still working well into the 20th century, right? Like Margaret Thatcher's rise. Absolutely. Her journey, from a state grammar school, Key Stephen and Grantham girls, to Oxford, it showed the system in the 50s and 60s was still flexible enough to bring in talent, co-opt it, and maintain its power base through that kind of meritocratic recruitment.
Okay, so that's the elite side. Dynamic, adaptable.
That's one side of the coin, yeah. Now, you have to contrast that with what was happening, or rather not happening, with the working class. A kind of deep structural paralysis seems to set in.
Wow.
The historian Tara Martin Lopez talks about this. Those impressive gains made by the working class after World War II, the foundations of the welfare state, they started to, quote, congeal and dissolve under the pressure of inflation in the 1970s.
Right. So the elite could keep reinventing itself to protect its position, its wealth. But the working class was facing this economic erosion, this stagnation.
Yes, and that culminated in those massive defining strikes in 1978, 1979, the winter of discontent. They were structurally quite immobile, struggling to adapt to those economic pressures.
Okay, so you have this economic fissure opening up, the elite adapting, the working class stuck. That feels like a crucial backdrop for the cultural shifts that came next.
It's absolutely the necessary context. Yeah, the working class was becoming economically vulnerable just as the whole social contract was starting to fundamentally change.
And the 60s and 70s were just culturally seismic, weren't they? I mean,
Yeah.
the social liberalization alone was huge. Consensual gay sex decriminalized, the right to abortion
The
recognized.
pound devalued. It was all happening concurrently, a real period of tumult.
But maybe the deepest cultural pressure, according to the sources, came from the new immigrant communities starting to demand recognition. Not just economic fairness, but cultural rights.
That's a key shift, isn't it? From purely economic demands to cultural ones. There's that example of Tarsum Singh Sandhu, the Sikh bus driver in Wolverhampton back in '67.
Right, the turban case.
Yeah. He fought for the legal right to grow a beard and wear his turban while driving the bus. This wasn't about pay packets. It was about the visibility of a different culture, asserting its place within the broader British identity.
And the sources show the reaction, the rebellion against this growing diversity. It ignited almost instantly. It was pretty extreme from the get-go.
It really was. You see this immediate attempt, politically and judicially, to kind of normalize profound racial intolerance. Take that 1978 case involving the politician John Kingsley.
Yeah, the language cited is just shocking. We should say,
Yeah.
we report this because it's in the source material and it shows how quickly this stuff entered the mainstream.
Exactly. He's quoted using these flagrantly racist terms in public. Niggers, wogs, and coons had no place in England. And then, horrifyingly, commenting on the killing of a Sikh youth by saying it was one down and a million to go.
It's hard to even comprehend that language being used publicly by a politician. But the judicial context makes it even worse, doesn't it? It shows the institutional tolerance.
It does. Judge Neil McKinnon, presiding over the case, apparently observed that his own childhood nickname had been nigger, and therefore, he reasoned, just using the words wasn't necessarily inflammatory.
Wow.
That one observation tells you so much about how deeply embedded the accepted prejudice was, right within the institutions that were supposed to deliver justice. It set a really, really terrible tone for what came after.
And that kind of institutional tolerance, or maybe normalization, it paved the way for these racial anxieties to move from the fringe right into mainstream political strategy, particularly within the Conservative Party.
Oh, definitely. The embedding started pretty early. You had figures like the Conservative MP Cyril Osborne arguing back in the 60s that England was, quote, a white man's country and I wish it to remain so. Quite explicit.
But the real watershed moment, the one that proved race politics could win elections, was Smethwick in 1964. For listeners who don't know, Smethwick was this industrial town, West Midlands, usually safe labor territory.
It became infamous, didn't it? A real landmark of race baiting in politics. The Conservative candidate, Peter Griffith, his campaign used this incredibly flagrant language. The slogan, reportedly, was, if you want a nigger neighbor, vote Liberal or Labor.
Unbelievable.
And it worked. He got this massive 7.2% swing to the Conservatives, defeated the sitting Labor MP. That election sent a clear message to the political class. Fear sells. Fear wins votes.
And that context makes Enoch Powell's infamous 1968 speech, the Rivers of Blood speech in Walthamstow, seem less like an aberration and more like a culmination, right?
Exactly. His message was actually quite sophisticated in its way. He wasn't just ranting against immigration numbers. He was warning against demands for what he called special communal rights. Or should I say rights? He argued that would lead to societal fragmentation.
And then came that explosive line.
The prophecy that the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. It wasn't just crude racism. It was framing cultural diversity itself as an existential threat to, well, to white England. It gave prejudice an intellectual veneer.
And Margaret Thatcher, she clearly understood the power of tapping into these fears. Was it purely cynical politics, do the sources suggest, or was there a genuine internal conflict within conservatism?
Well, the sources certainly point to the electoral calculation. Early in 1978, just before she became PM, she gave that interview talking about white fears that this country might be swamped by people with a different culture.
Right, the swamped comment.
Exactly. And the impact was immediate. A dramatic shift in polling support away from Labor. It definitely helped her consolidate power and defeat opponents within her own party, too. It was politically very effective.
But here's the paradox the sources highlight. While she used that anti-immigrant sentiment to win power, she also simultaneously laid the foundations for what became official multiculturalism.
Oh.
How does that square?
It's a huge contradiction, isn't it? The sociologist Jenny Bourne argues quite forcefully that Thatcher's multiculturalism was effectively a kind of informal apartheid.
Apartheid, that's strong.
It is. Bourne's argument is that it wasn't about genuine integration or social mixing. It was a strategy of dividing immigrant groups into these distinct ethnic and religious enclaves. You know, the checkbox approach to identity politics. It focused on managing groups based on their purported separate needs rather than fostering interaction. So it actually enshrined separation even while paying lip service to diversity.
We should probably note, though, that not everyone in her party was on board with the anti-immigrant rhetoric. There were economic conservatives.
That's true. Figures like Edward Boyle, Ian MacLeod, the sort of one nation Tories, they pushed back, arguing from an economic perspective that immigrants were actually crucial for keeping the economy going, stopping wages spiraling upwards in the post-war boom.
But their arguments got drowned out.
Yeah. Seems the cultural argument, the grievance argument, ultimately won out over the purely economic one.
Okay, let's jump forward then. Fast forward to today and the rise of Nigel Farage, first with UKIP, now the Reform. How does his appeal connect back to this history we've traced, the class paralysis, the cultural fragmentation?
Well, Farage himself, his background is interesting. Traditional conservative roots, stockbroker's son, private school, city trader, not exactly a man of the people in the traditional sense.
No. Different background to Thatcher, even.
Very different. But his great insight, and this is something the political analyst Tim Montgomery really zeroed in on, was recognizing that both major parties, Labour and the Conservatives, had essentially become creatures of the City of London.
They'd become detached,
Yep.
culturally monotone.
Exactly. Montgomery pointed out how all the influential figures, Tories especially, but increasingly Labour too, they lived in London. They absorbed, as he put it, its prosperity, its multiculturalism, its skyline, its sexual liberalism, and its internationalism, this very dynamic cosmopolitan elite.
Had lost touch with the rest of the country. The other Britain.
That's the phrase Montgomery used. He said, but London is only part of Britain. And that really captured the divide. And Farage's party's UKIP then, Reform, now spoke directly to that other Britain, often rural small-town England. Places where the working class maybe still felt paralyzed, where wages felt depressed, where globalization felt like a threat, not an opportunity.
And UKIP really honed in on those twin anxieties, didn't they? The economic and the cultural.
Precisely. Economically, European immigrants were framed, rightly or wrongly, as direct competitors threatening already low wages. And culturally, there was this traditionalist shock, particularly around things like Prime Minister Cameron legalizing same-sex marriage. For that constituency, London felt like this alien, liberal entity that was imposing its values on the rest of the country.
So it's like the failure of that elite knife to properly absorb the grievances from below, combined with the failure of that apartheid multiculturalism to actually integrate communities.
It all culminates in the fragmentation, the polarization we're seeing right now. The two failures fed off each other.
Which brings us right up to the present.
To the precipice, maybe. The sources paint a pretty stark picture of the reality on the ground now, in terms of social separation.
They really do. The failure of integration isn't just academic, it's measurable. And it's quite tragic. Less than 1 in 7 relationships in the UK apparently cuts across racial lines.
1 in 7. That's low.
It is. Communities remain, in the words of one source, profoundly ghettoized. There's a real lack of genuine social interaction spaces where people from different backgrounds naturally mix. It's not just theory. It's lived reality for millions.
And the consequences can be immediate, personal, and devastating. The sources mention that killings of daughters, particularly from Indian subcontinent communities who choose to marry for love against family wishes, that this remains a depressing part of the landscape.
Yeah, that's the horrific sharp end of decades of this formalized separation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where cultural boundaries become absolute and tragically enforced.
And this wasn't unforeseen. There were international warnings years ago. There were. Back in 2018, a UN special rapporteur explicitly warned about structural socioeconomic exclusion of racial and ethnic communities in the UK, and crucially also warned about a growth in the acceptability of explicit racial, ethnic, and religious intolerance. The alarm bells were ringing.
So if we try and synthesize this whole story, this century of unraveling, maybe, you've got the dynamic elite, the paralyzed working class, the rise of cultural fragmentation, the failure of integration. What's the core lesson you take away from the sources?
I think the core lesson, maybe the bleakest one, is that for something like 4 generations now, England's different racial and cultural groups have effectively been pushing each other closer and closer to a precipice. The underlying assumption, perhaps enabled by that flawed model of multiculturalism, was that their separate, walled-off lives, as one source puts it, would somehow insulate them from the rising tide of hate and misunderstanding.
But that model failed.
That model has clearly failed, and that huge march we talked about, commemorating cultural grievance, whatever its specific cause, it demonstrates pretty vividly that the time for denial or for hoping separation would work is over. The time for a genuine, difficult national conversation seems to be running out very fast.
Which leaves us, and leaves you, the listener, with a pretty challenging thought, doesn't it? We've traced how this populist anxiety, fueled by decades of structural failure and cultural division, has reached this point. So what actually happens when a society tries to resolve decades of deep cultural fragmentation and profound class paralysis, all at the same time?
Yeah, that's the terrifying question, isn't it? The really critical issue now is how violent, how disruptive those necessary processes of accommodation, of finding a new way to live together might to come. Britain seems to be confronting decades of unreconciled history all at once, and that convergence of crises makes this not just a moment of reckoning, but potentially a period of really profound social danger ahead.